Margaret Chen had spent 37 years building a life she thought was solid. At 62, with silver hair framing her gentle face, she'd raised 3 children, managed a household, and stood beside her husband Robert through every milestone. She was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who brought casseroles to grieving neighbors, who never raised her voice. Robert was a successful attorney, distinguished, respected. He worked long hours, or so he said. Margaret never questioned it. Trust was the foundation of their marriage, wasn't it? Their youngest, Emily, had just graduated college. The house felt empty now. Margaret found herself with time. Time she'd never had before. Time to notice things. It started small. A receipt for jewelry she'd never received. Perfume on his collar that wasn't hers. Phone calls he'd take in another room. When she asked about it, Robert would smile, that charming smile, and say, "Don't involve yourself in work matters, Margaret. You wouldn't understand all these client complications anyway." Then came the words that changed everything. "I'm too busy for this right now." Too busy. For her. For their life together. Margaret stopped asking questions. But she didn't stop observing. She discovered the credit card statements hidden in his office. Hotels. Restaurants. A pattern of Tuesday and Thursday nights. She found the texts he'd forgotten to delete. The woman was named Vanessa, younger, a paralegal at his firm. Margaret sat in their bedroom, hands trembling, and felt something crack open inside her. Not heartbreak, exactly. Something colder, clearer. She could scream. She could confront him. She could cry. Instead, she got quiet, very quiet. Margaret began documenting everything. Photographs of statements, screenshots, dates and times. She consulted her own attorney, an old friend named Patricia, who'd always admired Margaret's strength. They made plans, careful, methodical plans. But Margaret wanted more than a divorce settlement. She wanted Robert to understand what he discarded. She started small. She stopped doing the 100 invisible things she'd always done. His favorite meals disappeared from the table. His dry cleaning stayed at the shop. The social calendar she'd maintained for decades went blank. When his partners invited them to dinner, she was suddenly unavailable. When his mother called, Margaret was out. Robert barely noticed at first. He was too busy. Then Margaret joined a book club. She started painting again, something she'd loved before marriage but had abandoned. She volunteered at the community center, teaching art to seniors. She reconnected with old friends, women she'd lost touch with while raising children, and supporting Robert's career. She became visible, but not to him, to everyone else. People started commenting on how radiant Margaret looked, how vibrant. Her daughter Emily noticed the change and said, "Mom, you seem really happy lately." Margaret smiled. "I'm rediscovering who I am." At the firm's annual gala, Margaret wore a deep blue dress and her grandmother's pearls. She was luminous. She spent the evening talking with Robert's partners, charming them with stories and insights about the lull she'd picked up from 3 decades of listening. She danced with the senior partner. She laughed freely. Robert watched from across the room, confused. When had Margaret become so magnetic? Vanessa was there too, hovering at the edges, suddenly looking very young and uncertain. The senior partner, Thomas, pulled Robert aside that night. "You're a lucky man, Robert. Margaret is remarkable. Don't take that for granted." Robert felt something twist in his chest. The next Tuesday, Margaret wasn't home when Robert returned. No note, no dinner, just silence. She was at the community center, surrounded by students who adored her, laughing over paint-splattered canvases. When she came home at 9, Robert was waiting. "Where were you?" "Out," Margaret said simply. "I'm busy." The word hung in the air between them. Over the following weeks, Robert began to see what he'd been too busy to notice. Margaret had built an entire life that didn't include him. She had friends, purpose, joy. She didn't need him. He tried to reconnect. Flowers appeared on the kitchen counter. Margaret put them in water without comment. He suggested dinner out. She had plans. He tried to talk about his day. She listened politely, but her eyes were distant. "Margaret," he finally said one evening, his voice cracking, What's happening to us? She looked at him for a long moment, really looked at him. Then she spoke, her voice calm and steady. You said not to involve you in my problems because you were too busy. So I stopped. I became too busy as well. Too busy to wait for someone who didn't value my time. Too busy to shrink myself for someone who didn't see me. I see you now, Robert whispered. Do you? Margaret asked. Or do you just see that I'm no longer waiting? The truth settled between them like dust. Robert discovered the divorce papers 3 weeks later. Patricia had done excellent work. Margaret would receive half of everything, the house and a generous settlement. There were also detailed records of Robert's affair, evidence that would make any contested divorce very uncomfortable for an attorney who valued his reputation. You knew, Robert said, stunned. For 6 months, Margaret replied. I just got quiet about it. Why didn't you confront me? Margaret considered the question. Because confrontation would have given you the power, the chance to explain, to manipulate, to make me doubt what I knew. This way, I get my power back. Robert looked at his wife. This woman, he thought. He knew. I made a mistake, Margaret. A terrible mistake. Can we fix this? Margaret felt a wave of sadness, but also clarity. Some things, once broken, change shape. They don't go back to what they were. You chose to be too busy for our marriage. I chose to be too busy to fix it alone. I love you, Robert said desperately. You love the idea of me, Margaret corrected gently. The woman who made your life comfortable, who asked nothing, who was always waiting. But I'm not that woman anymore. I don't want to be. The divorce was finalized quietly. Robert's affair became whispered knowledge at the firm. His reputation tarnished. Vanessa had ended things months earlier. Sensing the changing winds, Margaret kept the house. She turned Robert's old office into an art studio, windows facing east to catch the morning light. She taught more classes. She traveled with friends to places she'd always wanted to see. Her children visited often, proud of their mothers. Transformation. 1 year later, Margaret stood in a gallery showing her paintings. They were beautiful, bold pieces filled with color and emotion. Emily stood beside her, beaming. Robert came to the opening. He stood in the back, watching Margaret laugh with admirers, watching her glow with confidence and purpose. She saw him there. Their eyes met across the room. Margaret walked over slowly. They stood together in front of one of her largest pieces. Abstract waves of blue and silver. It's called The Quiet Revolution, Margaret said softly. Lart nodded, understanding. You're remarkable. I should have seen it. Yes. Margaret agreed simply. You should have. There was no anger in her voice. No bitterness. Just truth. Are you happy? Robert asked. Margaret smiled. A real smile that reached her eyes. I am. I'm finally busy with the right things. As Robert left the gallery, Margaret turned back to her art, to her friends, to her life. She'd learned that sometimes the greatest revenge isn't dramatic confrontation or public humiliation. Sometimes it's simply becoming so fully yourself that you no longer need the person who tried to diminish you. She'd been told she was too small to matter, too convenient to value, too busy to involve. So she'd gotten quiet, and in that quiet, she'd found her roar. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for ourselves is refuse to shrink. Sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to matter in your own life first.